Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me wherever you are, however you may be joining me today. Thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking about Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century. Now, as we continue here, I just want to remind everyone that we're going to talk about the life of some of the people living here in the 17th century. And there will be topics such as slavery that come up here. And we need to make sure that when we talk, we often use factual terms, economic terms. But we need to remember these were people. They need to be addressed with compassion, with empathy, and with kindness and caring. Even historical facts in the past can carry hurt for some. And we need to make sure that as Christians we try to show caring and compassion. Now when we start discussing the lecture, it often comes across an economic or factual terminology, and that is how it's in history class or in economic class or etc. That is how it is discussed. But I just want to share and make sure that we remember and show kindness, caring, empathy. When we in any discussions, but especially when discussing history, because it can come across as insensitive if we're not very careful. And I want to emphasize that. All right. Question number 1 on Chapter 4: what percentage of people born in early Virginia and Maryland did not survive till their 20th birthday? This is a bit of a misnomer. It's half of the people born in early Virginia, half, did not survive to celebrate their 20th birthday. So the answer there is half. However, a great deal of that half was born, a great deal of those death rates occurred with babies being born, miscarriages, children dying in childbirth, and children dying at very young ages was extremely common. And this is one of the main reasons for this low birth rate. But the death toll in general was extremely high, especially in the early years there in the 17th century. In the Chesapeake Bay area, there was a lot more men than women. Women came very rare. The great majority of immigrants were single men in their late teens and early 20s. Most perished soon after survival. They outnumbered women 6-1. Most men could not find mates, and most marriages were destroyed by the death of a partner within 7 years. Scarcely any children reached adulthood under the care of two parents, and almost no one knew a grandparent. Weak family ties were shown, were reflected in the many pregnancies among young unmarried girls. Question number 2: what social problem is common in the South, and in one county, what statistic exhibits this problem? The social problem was that there was a lot of teen pregnancies, a lot of illegitimate births, and in one Maryland county, more than a third of all brides were already pregnant before they wed. Now this is in contrast, and we'll talk about this a little later, to the morality and the moral life of the New England colonies. This is just how it was. There was a great number of illegitimate, as they're called, births in the Chesapeake Bay colony. The Chesapeake Bay colony mainly thrived, and its main profit was tobacco. That was what the main you planted tobacco and then they sold that, and that was their main thing. Tobacco takes labor to farm, to process. Okay, and what was the labor they used for that? The labor they used for that was called indentured servants. Question number 3 is: how many indentured servants were brought to the Chesapeake Bay settlements by 1700? And I'm going to read out of our textbook here. Ravenous for both land and labor, Chesapeake planters brought some 100,000 indentured servants to the region by 1700. These white slaves, it's in quotations there, represented more than 3/4 of all European immigrants to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century. These indentured servants came, and they had a 7-year period of time where they had no freedom. They were exactly slaves for 7 years. At the end of that 7 years, they then would be set free and given, I believe, just like a set of clothes and maybe an axe or something to start. However, many of them were not given their freedom because of what they call freedom's dues. Misbehaving servants, such as a girl who became pregnant, or a laborer who killed a hog, or any little other thing, they might be punished with extended terms of service. So what you had here was a great number of indentured servants A great many of them reached their freedom, but a great many did not, and a lot of them, their 7-year period that was expanded to 10 or 15 years. So you had a great number of individuals working for no wages for a long period of time, and many, if not most of them, died before they ever received their freedom. The ones who did receive their freedom, often there was not land. Part of the reason there wasn't land was because the British government at that time, Governor Berkeley, William Berkeley, was really focused on trying to keep the settlers out of the western regions to keep peace with the Indians. And so there was limits, and they would not allow land, and they were really limiting westward expansion as much as possible. What happened is you have a lot of and I'll read from the textbook here. An accumulating mass of footloose, impoverished freemen was drifting discontentedly about the Chesapeake Bay area. They were mostly single young men. They were frustrated by their broken hopes of acquiring land, as well as by their gnawing failure to find single women to marry. They were unhappy. Bacon's rebellion basically was, there's a lot of frontiersmen, and they went, and they were in areas that Berkeley did not allow, and Berkeley refused to support them and protect them from the Indians who were attacking them in areas of Berkeley, and the British government said they were not allowed to live. And they were actually friendlier to the Indians. As a result of this, Berkeley, there was a bit of an uprising because they refused to, because the British government refused to support and protect these settlers. Berkeley they actually marched on Jamestown and put a torch and burned the capital of Jamestown. Berkeley responded by hanging. He crushed the uprising with brutal cruelty and hung more than 20 of them. So that it is the first case of independent spirit showing up in the New World like that. But and the textbook here says Bacon had ignited the smoldering unhappiness of landless former servants, and he had pitted the hardscrabble backcountry frontiersmen against the haughty gentry. This is a good case of income inequality. You often hear that term discussed in politics today. You had a group of people that were basically wealthy landowners owned most of the land, and there was extreme inequality, and that was the main force driving this conflict. We're going to continue on here to number 4. It says, how many slaves were in Virginia in 1670, and what percentage of the southern colonies as a whole were slaves? Africans had been brought, I'm reading out a textbook here, Africans had been brought to Jamestown as early as 1619. We're not sure if they were slaves or not, but they were brought there. But as late as 1670, they numbered only about 2,000 in Virginia. So your answer there is there was 2,000 in Virginia. And what percentage of the southern colonies as a whole were slaves in 1670? About 7% of the entire southern colonies were in 1670 were slaves. So it's important to remember that the colonies have been established, they've begun to thrive, but it was not on the backs of, as some have perhaps said, of slavery, that there was a very low number of African, which became African American slaves, population in this time. It was actually on the back of the white indentured servants. Now, later on, the economy of the South will be based on slavery, but at this time it is not. It is worthwhile, if you happen to have your textbook out, to note the slave imports to the New World statistics there. You will know, and I'm not exactly sure where the Danish Caribbean is. It might be the island of St. Thomas, but it is one tiny island in the Caribbean. So, with the exception of the Danish Caribbean, British North America and future United States brought in around, at most, 400,000, and I've seen other statistics which say it was actually more like 300,000 slaves to the United States. This is in comparison to several million which went elsewhere, like Brazil, 2.5 million. The British Caribbean, 1.5 million. The population of slaves that were transported to the United States was actually shockingly low compared to the others. And a great deal of that was simply because they didn't perish, they didn't die as quickly. The treatment in the United States, as horrible as it was and horrific as it was, and I want to emphasize here, it was bad, it was wrong, they were treated very horribly. Say that again. It's bad, it was horrible, they were treated very wrongly. I do not want to minimize that. But the treatment in the United States was such that they didn't just die in massive numbers compared to in the West Indies and in South America, where they died in just increasingly extreme high rates. And so many died that they were constantly having to import a lot more slaves to fulfill the workforce. And that is the reason you see such incredible numbers of slave importation series, because they died and they were treated so brutally that such a higher percentage died. Number 5, where did most of the slaves originally come from, and who captured and sold them? I'm gonna read over here. It's on page 71 of your textbook. It says most of the slaves came from the west coast of Africa, especially the areas stretching from present-day Senegal to Angola. And so where did they come from? West coast of Africa, Senegal, Angola, and they were originally captured by African coastal tribes who traded them in crude markets to European flesh merchants. Okay, so they came from Senegal and Africa. They were captured by the African coastal tribes, by other African tribes there, who then traded them to European and American flesh merchants. So that is the answer to number 5. Quick note, if you're looking at your textbook, the Mennonites of Germantown, Pennsylvania, recorded the first protest against slavery in the New World in 1688. That's worthwhile as noting, because many of us, or many individuals, have Mennonite background, and it's just a comment worth noting. The Mennonites have long held for the position against slavery. Number 6, page 72 of the textbook, in the second paragraph, states about the earliest African immigrants who gained their freedom. Some even did what? And I'm going to read here again out of the textbook. A few of the earliest African immigrants gained their freedom. That is, they were bought or sold, and maybe as slaves, but they were given, and they were treated as indentured servants. So after a few years, they then became free and were treated. And some of them who had gained their freedom even became slave owners themselves. We're talking here about economic terms, and I want to emphasize this. We're talking about economics. Race and ethnicity is not part of this at this time. It will become part of it, and a little bit later, actually very shortly afterwards. In the very next paragraph, it talks about that in the 1660s. But in the earliest years, the first 40, 50 years, this was not a race issue, and I want to emphasize that in history. We're trying to talk about historical facts. We're not trying to discuss political discourse and debate and sensitive topics. So it may brush them, but I want to emphasize that. And one more, I want to again emphasize that how badly that often these indentured servants, and especially the Africans and the slaves that became, were treated. And we want to think back and think with compassion and empathy and caring, and to not refer to them as just or like in economic terms, like indentured servants and as objects. We want to think of them as people. We're going to move on here to the Southern Society. The Southern Society. Actually, let me jump here and read one more statement out of the textbook here. And I had mentioned about the slavery in Brazil, etc. It was so brutal. The captive black population of the Chesapeake area soon began to grow, not only through new imports, but also through its own fertility. Here, and I'm reading out the textbook. Remember this quote, or note this quote: making it one of the few slave societies in history to perpetuate itself by its own natural reproduction. Most slave societies in the world, the slaves were treated so horribly they died out. In the Americas, that is not actually the case. They were treated horribly. Do not want to minimize that, but they actually were one of the few slave societies in history that was able to perpetuate itself by its own natural reproduction. Southern society. I mentioned in Bacon's Rebellion how there was massive income inequality. A quick statistic of this is that 70% of the leaders of the Virginia legislature came what you call from the first families. Families established before 1690, and that is because it was like a manorial complex system, or feudalism or aristocracy created itself in the South, and we'll see that from there up until 1860. Families like the Lees and the Washingtons, etc. You could trace their heritage back several hundred years. And that is simply they claimed massive amounts of land and allowed people to rent and farm on that land and in payment. And because of that, they were able to increase their wealth and buy more land, and it was hard for others to ever get ahead. We see some of that today, perhaps in our society with the Jeff Bezos and the Bill Gates, who own $100 billion. They have wealth in $100 billion, but it's a very different thing in the sense that they do not. Their wealth comes from a corporation. Versus, such as George Washington's family, their wealth came through massive land, and so people didn't have land that they could own and just build on. There's a major difference there, but it's worth noting, especially in comparison to Massachusetts, where it was not that way. Continuing on here to number 7. Above all, the Puritan New England sought to defend what? The Puritan New England sought to defend, above all, the integrity of marriages. This was one of their foundational principles of all their laws. Their entire laws were established for various moral reasons, but the foundation of all was they believed their family unit and their marriage, and they had their laws designed to defend that integrity. That is important to remember. This community, this group of people, the Puritans, are the people that are the most successful in world history. They were the engine that drove our world's success. I personally don't come from Puritan heritage. My family comes from the South, in various ways. In fact, I believe on basically all directions. But it is important to note that even though it's not my personal heritage, I can look back at what was accomplished or what drove the success of the world back then, and that was the Puritans. And above all, they sought to defend the integrity of marriage. One interesting note here that's in our textbook, and I'm going to just mention it, is that the Massachusetts Governor William Phips, he was one, and he had a lot of brothers and sisters. In fact, his mother had 27 children. There was a total of 27 children, all by the same mother. It was very common that the women in the Puritan households, their jobs were having children, raising children, and running the household. Now, that is not to minimize. They ran. When I say ran a household, they often had some servants, some other people working for them. When I say a household, they might have you've got a farm, you've got livestock, you've got agriculture. They ran that. They were in management. They were in managerial positions. But they also did that, and part of those individuals they're managing was their family, in which they had very large families. That was of them. We're going to continue on here to the halfway covenant and the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials is something that's been discussed at length in various circles. And it goes back to, again, the integrity of marriage. In a sense, our textbook talks about how strong the Puritans were trying to defend the integrity of marriage. Outright abandonment was very rare, one of the few permissible grounds for divorce. If you committed adultery, you would get public punishment, perhaps a public whipping or a branding. It was very stern. They did not allow that, and they did not want that. And what happened was you had this atmosphere of almost restriction and claustrophobia. And what happened is there was some different people that were a little different, had some different beliefs. But one of whom actually was from the West Indies and was into voodoo. And she told some of the young impressionable girls about it. And some of the young impressionable girls, upset at someone else, decided to make up a bunch of lies, and said that these people were witches. And what you had was just a case of emotional extremism, and eventually quite a few people were put to death based on unverified, unproven things, based on emotionalism. Committed, but basically by these young girls against people they did not like. I'm not going to go into that a lot, but This is interesting, just because to bring comparisons to other places in history. This was not unusual. It was one of the ways of commitment devices that cultures use to keep people from bringing in immorality and ideas and accusing people of witches, and it kept people from teaching what they believed wrong theological doctrines. Continuing on here very quickly, the halfway covenant. The Puritans came, and a few years later, and a few years after the Puritans originally came, second and third generations, they were not as holy and devout as their forefathers. The Puritans that came to the New World were the most devout. They wanted a holy life, but their children necessarily all didn't follow that. And so what happened was you had a problem where there was the elect, or the visible saints, and the non. And so they allowed church membership and voting rights to some of those whose parents had been visible saints. And there was an immense dilution of the church's holiness, as I say, their focus on holy living. And the halfway covenant was part of that. And that was they gave partial membership rights to the Puritan congregations. Part of that, or the reaction out of that, was a great a loss of their focus and religious fervor, which came back about and through we'll talk about later, through the First Great Awakening. The New England way of life. And you're going to have some readings on this, so I'm not going to spend a long time on it. But question number 8. The Puritans, due to their backbending toil, put a premium on what? They put a premium on industry and frugality. Okay, they were frugal with their money, and they did not, and they worked hard. And this is something that today we look back at and we talk about. There's a book called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It was written by Max Weber, or that's a German, so there might be a German pronunciation for that. He's called the father of sociology. Most of you have heard of the study of sociology. That is a field of study, and it was literally originally invented by this man named Max Weber, because he noted that the spirit of Protestantism had a work ethic intertwined with it, and that was driving capitalism and commercial success. And that's important to remember, and I'm not going to belabor this point right now, but the spirit of capitalism and the work ethic of the Protestants and the Puritans is what drove the economic success. Those values they exhibited that came from their focus on holy living is what drove the success, not the aristocracy of Virginia. It was not the feudal manor lords that drove the success, where they had a few people with thousands working for them. No, it was the hard-driving work ethic of the Puritans. Some people said that the 3 stages of progress in New England were to get on, to get honor, and to get honest. Honesty, hard work, taking pride, things like showing up on time. If you're supposed to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're there at 8 o'clock, not 8:10. That's stuff that it was driven by the Protestant work ethic. The English settlers and Puritans especially thought the Indians were rather wasteful. They condemned the Indians for wasting the earth by underutilizing its bounty, and used this logic to take the land from the Indians and then to clear it and build towns and villages. They thought the Indians were not using God's resources as it was intended, and therefore it was their duty to use it and build upon that. And again, that is you had livestock then introduced, etc. It's just a different way of life. There was some very great fishing. There was fishing areas off New England that were very beneficial and helpful to a lot of New Englands. In fact, our textbook says that the fishing areas yielded more wealth than all the treasure chests of the Aztecs. That's just a note, side note there. The Aztecs, no, it's not all of South America and Central America, or of the gold mines down there. That's not what I'm saying, but just to give you an idea, it was very helpful. Question number 9: the combination of Calvinism and climate in New England made for what character traits? It made for energy, purposefulness, sternness, stubbornness, self-reliance, and resourcefulness. When we talk about Americans, we often talk about they're independent of spirits, they're hardworking, they're stubborn, they rely on themselves, they're not going to the government and asking for a handout. That's what we talk about when we talk about Americans. Okay, this is where this comes from. These people, they believed in energy, hardworking, they had a purpose. They were stern. When you went to work, you're at work. It's not playtime. They were stubborn. They were hard to change their minds. Okay, self-reliance. This is something you'll find. If they didn't have money, they did not go to their family begging for money. They did not go to others just asking for handouts. Part of this Protestant work ethic was they were self-reliant. You stood on your own 2 feet. You didn't go asking for handouts. And resourcefulness. They were creative, coming up with various things. And I believe this is question number 10. New Englanders prided themselves on being what? They prided themselves on being God's chosen people. They believed they were God's chosen people and wanted to exhibit the characters and values they believed reflected Him. And that is important here. I'm going to say it again. These people had moral values, and their focus on holy living is what drove their success and the success of our country, and eventually the success as the United States has dragged the world out of poverty. And it's been their focus in the 1600s and 1700s which drove our economic success. What trait came to be claimed by all Americans? It was a New England trait. That is question number 11, and that is called Yankee ingenuity. They were creative people. Also, there's the New England conscience and a legacy of high idealism of national character that a lot of future reformers copied. The last question here, and the last point I want to make here is that there was the style of preaching. They preached hell and burn fire in the old Puritan churches. They didn't preach a lot of soft, wishy-washy gospel. The way they preached, their focus was they really focused on people getting in and converting. All right. There was a lot of doom-saying Old Testament. Earnest preachers, and I'm reading out of the textbook, earnest preachers scolded parishioners for their waning variety. All right. A famous jingle of those days was, "I come from Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where Cabots speak only to Lowells and Lowells speak only to God." You'll know, and there's other little poems that talk about some of this, but that is it was a main key there. Is that. And the last thing I want to note in this chapter is that Puritans, the people who came, were middle class. They were not the aristocracy. They were not the rich and wealthy of England. They also were not, and I'm going to read here, accordingly, most white migrants to early colonial America came from neither the aristocracy nor from the dregs of European society, with the partial exception of the impoverished indentured servants. In New England, with not talking about the South, which came, a lot of indentured servants and slaves came to. These people were the hard-working, upright, middle-class citizens of England and of East Anglia. Okay, this was not the dregs, as our textbook says, of society. The people who did not show initiative and work ethic. And that is important to remember. In fact, they were very strong against allowing those people to come into their societies. They rejected them. They would not allow them. They did not want people who were not interested in standing on their own 2 feet and working hard to come. That is the end of chapter 4. I'm going to try to make these lectures a little shorter as we continue on here. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.